lesson, I'm moving on from box 1, which I call the root box, into box 2, which I call the Albert King box. Now for this lesson, I'm going to switch to the key of F sharp, which is the key that Stevie Ray Vaughan played Texas Flood in. Now if you're tuned to standard E tuning, you're going to want to drop everything that I'm playing down a half fret to be in the same tuning as I am. But for those of you who are used to tuning down half a step to play Stevie stuff, this is going to be very useful to you when you go to play songs like Texas Flood, because this will be in the same key that that song was written in. And a lot of the riffs that I'm showing you today are ones that can be used in that song because it's a very well-known slow blues tune. There is going to be a much longer, more detailed version of this lesson that you can buy at steviesnacks.com. I shoot these lessons in HD quality, and the video quality for downloads is incredible. And I'm going to be doing a lot of up-close demonstration of different things that is going to be very useful. And there's a lot of things that I'm teaching in the full lesson that are really going to enhance your ability to use this box. But without any further ado, let's get into the Albert King box, which is one of my favorite blues boxes of all time. I'm just going to play a couple of riffs that you can play inside the Albert King box. I'm going to try and play them fairly slow. That way maybe you can pick them up from the video. I'm probably going to teach a lot of different Albert King riffs in individual lessons in the future, but this is just a few that you can play in this box. So that's just an example of the kind of riffs that you will hear when somebody is playing inside this box. It has a very kind of intense, kind of has an urgency to it. So now let's move on to the reviewing the structure of the Albert King box. Alright, like I said before, for this lesson I'm going to be playing in the key of F sharp, and since I'm tuned down half a step, this will probably look like the key of G for everyone else. But let's review where the 1 box, or the root box as I call it, is relative to the Albert King box. Now you can go back to lesson 25, I believe it is, where I introduced the 5 different blues boxes that I use most frequently. But the root box is just these notes right here. So if you can remember that the root box ends with these 2 notes up here. So these kind of form the northern border of the 1 box, and they also form the southern border of the Albert King box. So the Albert King box, the structure of it again, is just these notes right here. Alright. So let's take a look at this structure. What do we have here? Well, you can see that this note right here is the same as the root note in the root box. And we had talked in the last lesson about how you can end a lot of riffs on the root note. Well, that's amplified even more in the Albert King box, because the kind of signature riff that is played in this box is, which of course ends on the root note. Alright, now let's talk about the roles that each of the main notes in this box play. Alright, let's start with the top note of the Albert King box. Now the odd thing about this note is that even though it is one of the main notes that I put into this box, it's not really used too much by itself. Its primary role is to be bent. And there's a real kind of fine art to bending this note and getting a lot of different sounds out of it depending on how far you bend it, because this is not quite the same as, it has a little bit of a different tone to it. Since you're not bending it the whole way, it kind of feels a little bit incomplete. And if there's one thing that you really need to be careful of when you're using this type of riff, is that your bend is exactly where you want it to go. So if you're trying to bend up to this note, you need to make sure that you hit that note and not or this. Now that's not to say that you always have to bend up a complete whole step, but the point is that if that's the note that you're trying to hit, you want to make sure that you actually hit it, because the more you get into playing in this box, it becomes very obvious when somebody is not paying very close attention to their bends and is not hitting them right on. Alright, so this note here, once again, is most often used as part of a whole step bend. And then usually it's followed by a... Alright, now let's drop down to this note, which again is in the upper border of the one box. So let's think there's really kind of two purposes that this note plays. It's usually used on the trip down from this bend down to the root note. You don't hear this very often. There's got to be something in the middle, and that's usually where this note comes in. And that's really a fundamental element of, first of all, Albert King's style, and then so many other guitarists after him, including Stevie Ray Vaughan, of course. So let's review again. We got the top note here, which is usually bent all the way up the whole step. Usually play it straight on the way down, and then follow it up with the note right here, and down to the root note. Which brings us to the root note. Usually this note serves, the root note in this box usually kind of serves as a landing pad for a lot of high-flying bends. And you're going to have to get used to really hitting this note with some serious vibrato. Now the vibrato technique that I'm using here is very similar to what I taught back in, forget which lesson it was, where I talked about the vibrato technique from the song Lenny. It's very similar to that. And what you're doing is you're putting your thumb over the top like an anchor, and you're just moving this string. You got all three fingers on the string, but you're really only pressing down with your ring finger on the root note here. And you're just moving the string back and forth, and you can actually get a decent amount of ring even without picking. So when you add to it a good strong pick, you really get that piercing vibrato sound. Alright, let's drop a whole step from the root note down to this note right here. Now this note doesn't get a whole lot of love. It's not the kind of the featured player in a whole lot of riffs, but it is an important transition in a lot of other riffs. For example, if we're going to connect Box 2 down to Box 1, I taught a lesson on that a while back called Connecting the Boxes, and that riff of course starts with this one, this note. You can also use this note as part of another really standard blues riff, and that's just using these notes of this box. You can kind of end a riff by kind of pulling off onto this note, but it's never a really heavily accented thing. It's kind of like an afterthought at the end of the riff. And let's drop to the bottom note here. Again, this is kind of a role player note. It's not used a whole lot by itself, but I would like to add that these two notes, even though they're not really featured players in any riffs, they are two of the most commonly used blues notes when you hear something like this. So they just happen to form a very nice blues chord here. You can incorporate a little slide into those. So just to summarize the main notes of this riff, you got the top note, which is used mainly for high bends. You got this note, which is kind of like a stair down to this one. It helps connect the high bend to the root note. You've got the root note, which is kind of a landing pad and a starting point for a lot of riffs. And then you've got these two notes, which are kind of role players that don't do a whole lot on their own, but they can be used in a pretty nifty chord, as well as kind of gateways into other riffs like. Alright, now we're going to move on to some of the hidden notes inside the Albert King box. Alright, that's it for the free part of this lesson, but I want to encourage you to go over to steviesnacks.com and buy the full lesson. I have it in near HD quality so that you can see exactly what I'm doing on the fretboard. And there's a whole lot of really good stuff in the full lesson. I talk about some kind of hidden notes in this box. I talk about ways to use pickup switching to get that kind of how to get that screaming tone on the high end of the bends, but switch back to your other pickup on the way down. And then I also talk about three bending techniques. One I call the call and response. I talk about 3-string bends. And I also talk about walk-up bends. So there's a whole lot more in the full lesson at steviesnacks.com. If you really want to nail the sound of this box, I suggest you go over there and you pick that lesson up and really study it, and it can really add a whole another dimension to your playing. Alright, let's talk about the hidden notes inside the Albert King box. Now, because it's a pretty simple box, there's not a whole lot of hidden notes, but there is kind of a continuum of notes from here to here. And I'll explain that in a second when I talk about the different bending techniques. But let's focus on the one right in the middle, right here. If you remember last lesson, I talked about kind of the secret double life of Box 1. Which is, you know, it's kind of a normal minor blues sounding box, but inside of it, well, this note right here kind of serves as the upper end of 3 major scale notes, kind of connecting Box 1 to Box 2. So right here in the middle, you've got a note that can connect Box 2 to Box 1, but in a different fashion than, because that's kind of a minor blues riff, where you've got this. You can kind of think of using this note as a way to add just a little bit of major scale sound to a minor scale riff. The minor scale riff is characterized by kind of an aggressive sounding, very traditional blues sound, whereas notes like this are more of a traditional B.B. King sound. And so you can mix them together just by simply doing something like this. Instead of taking this bend all the way down like this, you can add this in here. And it's just a way to take this note, which is usually connects directly to the root, and you got to kind of pick your battles and kind of pick the points that you want to insert this note. But it's a way to add a little bit more flavor to what can kind of be an overused sound, which is just the standard. And this is something that I do to kind of mix it up a little bit, just to add a little bit of sweetness in there. And coincidentally, it's the same as in the one box. This is the upper form of this bar chord. So what you're doing is you're going from the minor third to the major third. So the same thing that you can do down here, you can do up here. So that's just one way that you can fit in this kind of hidden note. Let's talk about kind of an auxiliary note to the Albert King box, and that's this one right up here. Now it's kind of like an honorary member of this box because you use it a lot, you just don't play it. Now what I mean by that is that you use it by playing this bend right here. But you hardly ever go, because half the sound of this riff is the bend. So I like to include it as kind of an honorary member in the Albert King box because we pay tribute to it, but we don't really play it that much because we get better sound bending this note. So this is really the only real secret note in this box. But another one that's not terribly obvious is this note right here. And the reason I like to include that is because there are some times where I'll take the root note and bend it up. And it's one of those unusual times when you're bending more than a whole step. I'm actually bending up 3 half steps here. And that's not something that Stevie did a whole lot, but it's something that I discovered a while back as a way to add a little more flavor to the Albert King box. So it's just a little something extra in there. Now there is kind of one advanced trick to the Albert King box. It's kind of a hidden note, and that's this one right here. And it is outside of the boundaries that I've drawn. And it's one of those notes that, you know, you can bend to it. But usually what you're trying to do is bend past it. But I picked up something from Stevie a while back where he would slide from this note up to here, 1 half step, and back again real fast. So what you're doing is you're sliding up and back and then pulling off to this note. And it's just something that you can throw in there to spice up the riffs a little bit. Alright, let's talk about how you can transition from the Albert King box into the B.B. King box. Well, if you remember how we got from box 1 to box 2, one way that we got here was to slide in on the 2nd string. Another way was to slide up on the G string. So the 2nd and 3rd strings here are kind of like the highways connecting these boxes. And there's one really good way to get into the B.B. King box, and that's through the G string here. So let's see. Now the thing is that you're not really going to play a whole lot of Albert King style riffs back to back with B.B. King style riffs, but there's really only a couple ways to get into the B.B. King box, and this just happens to be the main one. So here's our Albert King box, and you're just going to slide up a whole step, and that puts you right in position for the B.B. King box, which I'll talk about in the next lesson. Now, if you remember in lesson 15, I talked about one of those monster riffs from Texas Flood, and you can buy that lesson with the tabs at steviesnacks.com. But he did a riff like this. So there's an example of transitioning from the Albert King to the B.B. King. All right, let's talk about how to transition from box 2, the Albert King box, down to box 1, called the root box. Now I'm going to reference a lesson that I taught a while back called Connecting the Boxes, and that was just a riff that goes like this. And usually that's played after something like this. And that whole lesson and the tabs are available at the video download store, and the free video is still up here on YouTube as well. So let's talk about other ways that you can transition from box 2 to box 1. Well, another lesson that I taught, I think it was number 15, about a really kind of advanced riff from Texas Flood. Stevie starts a riff going from box 2 to box 1 by going like this. And those notes are, and sliding right down to box 1. And where that would fit in is if you're playing something like this. So when you get to box 1, you usually follow it up with, one of the standard. So to review, the connections between box 2 and box 1 are more or less taking place on the G string here. There's another riff that Stevie plays, which is more just a slide. And then also this riff here is another way to get from box 2 to box 1. Not a whole lot of other ways that you do it, but this is by far the most commonly used one. Alright, now I'm going to talk about something a little bit more advanced, but it's something that I've gotten some questions about in the past as well. And that is the use of your pickups when you're doing riffs inside the Albert King box. Now, the reason that this is important is because when you hear riffs in this box, one of the things that really jumps out at you when you're listening to someone like Stevie Ray Vaughan or Albert King is just the real kind of screaming tone that you would hear when they would play riffs in this box. So let's talk about the very most basic thing in this box, which is the bend up. Now, when I've heard this riff played a lot, it's usually a kind of fatter sounding tone, and that can always be associated with the neck pickup. So that sounds a little bit fatter than. That's my bridge pickup. And this is my neck pickup. Especially when you come down to the root note here. Now here's where it gets tricky. When you're doing this bend, sometimes you want the most kind of trebly sounding wailing tone that you can get, and obviously that comes from your bridge pickup. But when you come back to the root note, you want more of a fat sounding, fuller sounding tone. So what's tricky is that you actually have to learn how to switch pickups in mid-bend. So you'd start on the one, on the neck pickup. You can see I'm in pickup position 5 here, at least what I call 5, which is the neck pickup. And as you go up to the bend, you flick down with your pinky, and you pick the note with your finger here, and you've just flicked down to the bridge pickup. And then when you come back down, you come back to the neck pickup. So it goes something like this. Let me try that again. You can hear on that last bend, you can hear how I switch back to the neck pickup. And so that way when I come back down to the 1, I'm on my more fatter sounding neck pickup again. So that's just a little trick that you can use when you're doing these bends to get a little extra scream at the top and a little more fuller sound at the bottom. Let's review that one more time. If you're going to play this riff, you hit 2 notes on the root note here in the neck pickup position. And as you go up to play this first bend, you want to swipe down with your finger and you want to flick the pickup selector down to the very bottom to the neck position. And as you hit that last bend, while you're bending there, you want to pull it back up with your pinky finger. And it's so subtle that most people probably won't even know what you just did, but it has a huge effect on how the riff sounds when you play it. I also want to talk about picking technique in this box, and the reason that this is important is that Albert King, when he would play these riffs, would be picking with his fingers. I can't remember if he tuned if his guitar was upside down or not, but I believe he had his guitar strung backwards so that he was picking with his thumb. Now, why that's important is that when you're picking out, like if you've ever heard somebody play slap bass, you get a real kind of smacking sound when you're picking out with your thumb. And since most of us don't have our strings reversed, we want to replicate that kind of real aggressive smacking sound, but you've got to do it with the fleshy part of your middle finger here. So if you can see when I pick this note, I'm actually picking with this finger instead of my pick. So you can play it with your pick, but you can get more scream if you do this. And so you just, while you're doing this top bend here, and that's just a way to get a little extra scream out of it, is to give it a good snap with your middle finger here. See, that sounds a little bit different then. That's another little hint for how to get some of that screaming tone out of it. Now, these last couple of things that I'm going to talk about are really important for learning how to use, kind of how to get the most out of the Albert King box. And what I'm going to talk about are 3 techniques for bending here. 3 kinds of bends that you can use in various ways to make different riffs. The first one is what I call the call and response bend. And this is best demonstrated by a really extreme riff that I heard Stevie play in a bootleg one time, and it went something like this. And what he did there was he did the standard, but then he followed it up with a bend down here. Now sometimes you can get away with actually using your index finger, and you can get a good half-step bend out of it that way, but it's hard to bend any more than that because this finger's just not made for bending strings that far. So the way that I compensated for that was to drop down and actually do this bend the same way that I did this one. And it's a kind of a call and response because you can think of this as the call and this as the response. And there's so many different times when Albert King would play stuff. So you can kind of think of this as the call. And that brings up another good use for this kind of middle note is he would play the first bend all the way up and then call and response with this one here. And once you learn that that's how that sound is created, you can really go out and learn an awful lot of what Albert King was playing and then what Stevie was playing by realizing that this sound is just inside this Albert King box using the call and response technique. Now I want to talk about 3-string bends. And I don't know if I ever heard Albert King do this or not. There's a good chance that he did. But Stevie really kind of got pretty well known for 3-string bends, which sound like this. And I'm playing it pretty sloppy there. But you can hear this in the second chorus of the Texas Flood solo off of the Texas Flood album. And he launches into it by playing something like this. Or something like that. But quite simply, the technique, there's no shortcut to this. All you're doing is taking the high E string here. You're starting to bend it up, but you're getting enough of your fingers onto the second string that you can actually fret those as well. And you're pushing it up until you can actually get the third string. So the way this effect is created is by getting the strings close enough on the fretboard where you can actually get them all under your finger. So what's cool is that Stevie would use that 3-string bend technique along with the call and response. So he would do something like, and it's a one-of-a-kind sound that you really can't fake it. You just got to get it to the point where you can bend those strings close enough to where you can fret them all with one finger. Alright, now the last thing that I want to talk about is walk-up bends. And this is kind of similar to the call and response bends, but with one important difference is that there's a lot more notes before you get back to the top. So I know you've all heard from like The Sky is Crying or sometimes in the live versions of Texas Flood, Stevie would have the band stop and he would go. And then he would start this. And that's a very important technique because it's used to kind of build energy into what follows. And the way that you do it is you just start on this part of the Albert King box. And you just bend up in little kind of quarter note increments. And you can kind of see it takes me 2 bends. So I can't really bend anymore with this one, so then I switch to this string. And I kind of cap it off at the end. So that's what I call the walk-up bends. And it's a very important technique to kind of get the most out of the Albert King box.